Hello. So, lesson, we'll talk about budgeting and forecasting. I know that we've already covered budgeting and forecasting in management accounting, but this time we'll be looking at budgeting and forecasting as a control mechanism. So we'll be looking at it from a management control lens. No, and hopefully, through this lesson or lecture, we're able to determine or we're able to look at the role of budgets from a strategic perspective, right? In management accounting, budgeting and forecasting were discussed in terms of their technical aspects. How to create a budget from scratch, how to how does a budget flow from a revenue forecast to a production forecast, no, to and how it flows into the income statement, to the balance sheet, and eventually to the statement of changes in statement of cash flows. No, statement of changes in equity, balance sheet, and statement of cash flows, and how to create a cash budget. So in management accounting, we look at budgeting and forecasting as a tool, no, for decision making. Here, what we'll do is we'll focus on the budgeting process and how the process and the output budget, no, uh, how it motivates people, how it becomes a tool for management control, and how the budgeting process and the budget itself is a strategic tool to make sure that employees are motivated to implement decisions or implement the strategies of a company. Okay. So what is a budget? A budget has been described in your management accounting class. I always describe budgets as this. The budget is a quantitative expression of the company's goals and objectives. Okay, let me write that down. So a budget is the quantitative expression, no, of the goals and objectives of an organization, right? At its core, the budget is a number, right? The budget is a set of numbers, now, that allows us to look at the expectation of results, right? Parang kung ito ang strategy ng company A, B, C, and D, how does that translate in terms of numbers? Pag sinabi mo ang strategy is to increase market share, precisely ilan? Ilang percent ang increase in market share? Okay? Or at the same time, in terms of pesos, ilan ba yan? In terms of revenues. Diba? Kasi strategies are words. We need to have a quantitative expression of it so that it becomes more implementable, right? So the budget is needed because it is needed so that we can implement the strategies and goals of an organization. At the end of the day, lahat ng strategies of an organization will need money, right? So strategy are words. These are words. But at the end of the day, what makes those words implementable is you have the cash, you have the money to use so that you can do strategies that will further those you can do tactics that will further those strategies. So that's why my favorite definition of a budget is that it's a quantitative expression of the company's goals and objectives. Okay. Now, looking at that link, that budget is critical because it links plans to reality, right? Kasi strategies are words, plans budgets naging numbers na, right? So kailangan ng lagyan ng reality yung words when uh, budgets are being created, right? So that's a critical step to implementation, no? Kasi kung gusto nating gawin ng mga strategies ni CND, dapat napondohan yan under the budget. Otherwise, kahit anong gawin ng lahat ng low-level managers, lower-level managers, they could not implement strategy if resources are not provided to it, right? So that's why the budget is the heart of management control, right? Because yun yung gitna eh. It is the middle, parang it's the link, between strategy and implementation. It has to be budgeted for it to be implemented. Otherwise, lower level managers can shout up and down so that they can and wants to implement the strategy. But if there's no money, no honey, right? It could be, I mean, if there's no money, there's nothing that they can do to implement this project, right? And money, resources requires returns, right? So for example, one strategy is to increase market share, right? To increase market share by 2%, for example, dapat may karampatang marketing programs, right? Marketing programs require resources. So the budget should be able to justify the resources for the returns that it will create. That's why in management accounting, you have that decision making, right? Pag you allocate additional fixed costs uh, for um, for new advertising, for example, no, it must be recovered with adequate volume. And so therefore, your marketing people should say na I need 2 million pesos and it will create 5 million pesos of sales. And with that, the math works out so that it will recoup the cost. So doon na tayo. We're now trying to bridge strategy and implementation through the budget. That's why budgets are very important in management control. And I would say, in your book says that that budgeting and forecasting is actually the heart of management control. And it's because it's the link between implementation and strategy. Dadaan ng budget yan eh. Right? Yung strategy na puro words lang, kailangan ng i-implement. And if kailangan ng i-implement, kailangan ng pera. And so therefore, that's why the budget is a very important tool in management control to make sure that strategy and implementation are there. Okay? Now, what are the rules of budgets of budgeting in an organization? Number one is planning. Ito yung inaral ninyo in your management accounting class, right? Because at the end of the day, when you create budgets, you're planning for the activities for the year. And since you're planning for the activities for the year, number one that you need to decide on is resource distribution. You have set resources, you have a target profit, right? Magkano budget ang ibibigay mo sa bawat responsibility center in an organization. So that those responsibility centers can perform their role in the overall strategic plan, right? And that's the challenge as far as budgeting is in terms of resource distribution. Resources are not overflowing. Resources are scarce. And with scarce resources, you should be able to allocate it to different responsibility centers with their own targets, right? So, syempre, those responsibility centers will fight for their budgets, okay? Because they need the money so that they can contribute to the overall strategy of an organization. That's their target, right? But if you're giving them so little, they can only achieve so much. No? So sometimes, so yung budgeting process is also an important um, process, no, to calibrate the strategy of an organization. Baka naman masyadong grand yung strategy natin, we cannot afford it. So a very important role of budgeting is planning, no, in terms of planning resource distribution. Another important role of budgeting is coordination. No? Even though different departments are different responsibility centers, for example, no, it's not normal that those departments have some uh, interplay with each other, right? So for example, sales and production, right? So ang role ng sales magbenta, ang role ng production or ng planta mag-produce, right? Now, they have to be coordinated, right? Otherwise, baka benta ng benta, hindi naman pala napoproduce. Or produce ng produce, hindi naman pala nabibenta. So the budget is an opportunity for the two to discuss, right? No, and to align on expectations with respect to production and the forecast, for example, for sales. Right? Kasi I'm sure ang production, the production team or the people sa planta, ang kanilang concern is inventory levels. Right? They could not keep high inventories kasi high inventories is tied up working capital as far as the plant is concerned. Yun namang sales, ano ang problema ng sales? Dapat may adequate inventaryo, right? Hindi ako pwedeng may stock out, right? So that tension is resolved through the budgeting process. Kasi sales people will show their numbers, production people will show their numbers, senior management will ultimately decide. No? And with that, that coordination and that mutual accountability, then yun na yung mas nagiging avenue for coordination for the budgeting process. Second key role of budgeting is accountability. And this is where control comes in. Okay? So the budget is also a tool for management control. Why? Because the budget can be a way for us to monitor results and to motivate employees in performing their tasks. Okay? So, monitoring, meaning kung may budget, compare mo ngayon yung actuals versus budget. And we can say or we can see whether a responsibility center is effective or efficient. As we mentioned, responsibility centers should be able to do that or to show that they are, or yung performance appraisal mechanism nila should show that they are both efficient and effective in their roles. So with a budget, there comes a quantitative expression of what efficiency might look like or what effectiveness may look like. And so therefore, it becomes a tool for monitoring. Another is a tool for motivation. If budgets are linked to performance measurement, then it may motivate them to make sure that they're within the budget, that they are faithful to the budget. And by being faithful to the budget, they're able to also to implement the strategies of an organization. Okay, so that's it in terms of monitoring and motivation. We'll discuss more of that later or throughout this process, throughout this lecture. Okay. Next, it is a process. It is a process which allows for reflection and communication within the organization. Okay. Sometimes the best way to communicate strategy within the organization is to show the budget, right? Kasi kitang-kita mo doon, nasaan ang focus ng organization. No? Kasi for example, if the organization is focusing on international expansion, makikita mo sa budget that there are a lot of resources being provided to international expansion. So sometimes it's the best way to communicate strategy, no, is to show it through numbers. Then kitang-kita agad ng mga employees na okay, dito ang focus kasi nandito ang resources. Okay? It is also a time for reflection in the budget. Okay? Kasi part of the budgeting process is for you to understand what was your past performance. Okay? Kasi yun yung magiging baseline mo for the budget next year. And with that, you are forced to reflect. You know, what did we do wrong last year? What did we do good last year? You know? And how will it aid us in creating a more accurate budget for this, this coming year? Okay? Budgeting is also a ritual. It provides some sort of habit and legitimacy to the processes of an organization. Okay? It's a habit, so predictability of the process. It means lahat sila, pag dumarating na ang June, for example, budget season na, for example. And nagiging na-ingrain in the organization ng discipline. Na by this time, you should be thinking of the future already of our company. Okay? So those are the key roles as far as budgeting is concerned. Okay? Next is the parts of the budget. I won't focus on this too much. You learn this in management accounting, but you know that every budget starts with the revenue forecast or the revenue budget. It starts there. Kasi kung ano yung ibibenta, yun ang kailangan pondohan. Right? And it is the most critical part of a forecast because all others are actually dependent on the revenue budget. The amount of resources that we can generate depends on the revenues that we can cash in for the organization, right? Pwede nating dagdagan ng GNA, pero kung wala na tayong pera, hindi na tayo magdadagdag ng GNA. Nasaan ba galing pera na yan? Galing sa revenues or galing sa capital infusions or sa loans? Pero capital infusions and loans, may hangganan yan. No? You can sell more, but it's difficult to find more investors. It's difficult to find new loans. So usually revenues dictate the scale of an operation of a company. Once you have the revenue, you have the number of units that you need to produce, then you now have the production cost or the cost of sales budget. Right? So nakaakma sa revenue kung magkano ang cost of goods sold or magkano ilan ang ipoproduce in a certain period. Okay? With that, marketing expenses are usually also tied to revenue budgets, obviously, because kung aggressive ang revenue forecast, dapat aggressive din ang marketing expenses mo to support your sales team. Okay? Otherwise, binigyan mo sila ng 20% increase na target sa revenue budget, di mo naman binigyan ng support in terms of marketing. Kawawa naman sila, saan nila kukunin yung 20%? No? Kung status ko lahat in terms of uh, in terms of uh, in terms of marketing or sales budget, right? Or sales or go-to-market budget, diba? So it doesn't make sense. And if the resource allocation, which is the marketing budget, and the target, which is a 20% increase in sales, does not match, will it motivate a person or a lower-level manager? No, right? Because it does not have the means to attain the goal. So, wala siyang magagawa. So, bakit siya motivate to work hard? Right? So, yun ang point of view natin dito. Okay? So, G&A and R&D, then income taxes will be derivative na lang yan, no, of the income statement. The capital budget depends on your expansion plans or maintenance plans. The balance sheet and the cash flow statement includes the funding on it. So you know this already, and it's something that you should be able to recreate again. No? Now, what I'd like to focus on in this lecture is the budgeting process. You know why? Because the budgeting process is the way the budget molds the organization. Kung paano yung budgeting process ninyo, namomold yung attitude ng organization with respect to budget, with respect to implementation, with respect to target. That's why very important is for you to decide what kind of budget preparation or what kind of budgeting process should we employ in our organization. Because that impacts the attitude of employees with respect to budgets and with respect to implementation. So there are three main types of budget preparation processes. One is top-down budgeting. Second is bottom-up budgeting. Third is iterative budgeting. Obviously, it's in the title, kung ano ibig sabihin, right? Top-down budgeting means it is set by top management and dictated to lower levels. Okay? Bottom-up budgeting means lower-level managers create the budget and participate in the budget process, and it is approved upwards. So it will, so departments or sections will propose projects to the department. The department will propose budgets to the responsibility center head, for example. The responsibility center heads will propose their budget to the corporate officers or to the CEO of the organization. Okay? So yun ang bottom-up budgeting, galing sa grassroots. Right? Iterative budgeting, on the other hand, starts out exactly like bottom-up, but is then repeated once or more until top management is content with consolidated budget figures. Okay? So nagsistart siya na bottom-up, pero pagdating sa taas, titignan ng top management, ay, hindi ko gusto yan. Balik. Then, gawa ulit kayo ng budget. Pagdating sa top management, kulang pa. Dagdagan niyo pa ng 5% increase yung profit targets. Gagawin na rin ng bottom ng lower level management until top management is happy with the result. No? So actually, yung iterative budgeting, para siyang combination ng bottom-up and top-down budgeting. Right? It starts out as bottom-up, but eventually, it is the management who will dictate. Okay? Most budget, I mean, I've been part of a few companies. So, um, in all of the companies that I work on, uh, it's iterative budgeting that's being used. No? So, nag-start yun sa budget proposal sa baba, pero pagdating sa taas, kailangan i-approve, of course, ng top-level management. And sometimes top-level management may not be happy with the initial draft. No? Sabihin nila, hindi ako happy na 5% increase lang ang net income next year. I'm more happy for a 20% increase. Work the numbers so that it's 20%. Then, trabaho din kayo. Then, that's why it becomes iterative. Okay? Let's look at each one and look at the pros and cons. Each of these budget preparation types suits a distinct type of company. It doesn't mean that top-down is bad or bottom-up is good. Okay? We have pros and cons, and some of these uh, budget preparation techniques, budget processes might be appropriate for certain types of companies or certain cultures. Okay, let's look at top-down first. So, if you look at this top-down budgeting, very this figure came from the book and it's very instructive. No? So the top-level management, oops, okay, let me erase this. So top management, yung gumagawa ng planning is top management. Okay? So top management does the planning. Okay? So they dictate the numbers. So for example, gusto namin ang sales increase next year 5%. Ang net income increase next year at least 20%. Right? So ibig sabihin, there's will be a lot of savings in between. Okay? So they will dictate the numbers based on the strategic plan of an organization. Hindi naman yan dictate as in dictatorial government lang. No? Yung basis yan, which is the strategic planning of an organization. Based on the strategic plans, top management will say, for us to be able to achieve these strategic plans, we need to have these kinds of numbers. Okay? For example, Division 1, or for example, let's look at URC. Okay? Foods division should increase by 5%. Okay? Poultry division should increase by 20%. Okay? Packaging division should increase by 5%. So obviously, based on the decisions of top management, nalalaman mo na doon kung yung strategy. Right? And then once those numbers are dictated, no, suggestions on how to work out the numbers is done by the controllership or finance departments. So parang finance na yung nag-aareglo ng budget. Okay? Sabi ng top management, ganito daw yung dapat nating maging result. Okay? So si finance, ina-areglo na niya. Para mangyari ito, ganito dapat yung mangyari. Right? 20% increase in sales, then X% increase in profit. Para mangyari yan, yung cost structure natin dapat ganito. Right? Once finance is done, with those preliminary numbers, they check on the ground. O manager A, okay ba sa'yo na ito lang ang budget mo? Then they will have suggestions. And there could be changes. And those changes could be consolidated. But at the end of the day, top management will um, approve on the final budget. Pero yung lower level management, they are relegated to a consultation process. Consultation lang. The budget did not actually originate from them, but only for consultation. So that's the top-down budgeting. What is the advantage of top-down budgeting? Of course, it's fast. Okay? And number two, top managers are in control over the output. No? Because at the end of the day, they are the ones who will be facing the board of directors. Maharap sa board, top management. And the board will ultimately approve the budget anyway in any of these or eight budgeting processes. What are the cons? Maybe less realistic, and there could be low commitment in an organization. Okay? Low commitment. Why? Because they were merely consulted. Hindi naman sila yung nag-originate ng budgets. Okay? So the top-down budgeting process might appropriate for some industries. For example, something that is an industry that is very predictable. For example, the business is very predictable. Very predictable yung business. Halimbawa, you're operating a toll road. Toll road operator. Okay? If you're operating a toll road, tapos no expansion na yung toll road, alam niyo ba kung ano yung toll road? Toll road is, for example, SLEX. Okay? So, let's assume that SLEX has no expansion anymore. Yan na yun. Mini-maintain na lang. Right? Now, in that kind of company, of operations, there could be very little changes in budget. Right? No, kasi toll roads, predictable naman kung ilan ang dumadaan. Right? Kasi hindi naman drastically nag-change yan from year to year, except during COVID. No? But both post-COVID or pre-COVID, no? I mean, very smooth naman ang increase ng number of vehicles. And it won't change drastically. And there's no strategy that you can do to change it drastically, to change revenues drastically. Right? So, bakit nag-make sense yung top-down budgeting for that kind of operation? Because there's nothing different. Right? And so therefore, everyone knows na, oh, increase lang yan by 3%. Okay? And that can be dictated and everyone in the organization understands why. Because they know that they're in a steady state operation already. No? So in that case, there's alignment between managers and top management. Pero kung if you're in a very different industry, na very fluid, it might not cut it. Right? Especially if there are strategies that are very new, na experimental, quote unquote, or breakthrough. So it's very difficult naman to dictate in those kinds of industries. In top-down budgeting, I sort of experienced it when I was in Procter& and Gamble. I was a finance analyst there. In PNG, then, I don't know now. Baka nabago na, medyo matagal na ako wala sa PNG. I used to budget for sales, no, selling, research, and admin expenses. Analyst ako niyan before for the whole Philippines. Okay. So for sales, research, and admin expenses, tatlo lang yung ibibigay sa yung guidance ng regional. It's either ZOG or NOG. Dalawa lang pala. ZOG or NOG. Ano ang ZOG? Zero overhead growth. Or NOG. Negative overhead growth. Kasi yung SRA expense, selling, research, and admin expenses, this is the overhead of the Philippine office. Okay? So pag budgeting season na, magsasabit ang Philippine office ng overhead cost to Singapore. Okay? Which is the regional headquarters. Okay. Sasabihin lang ng Singapore sa amin, oh, for this year, ZOG kayo. Which means zero overhead growth. So kahit anong mangyari, bawal mag-increase ang total SRA expenses. Right? Kasi ZOG kayo eh. Yun ang binigay na guidance ng Singapore headquarters. So top-down budgeting yun, right? Gawin mo, bahala ka kung ano gusto mong gawin. Basta zero ang total growth ng inyong overhead. Pag binigyan ka ng guidance na no, sasabihin sa'yo, o negative overhead growth kayo. So dapat mag-increase ang overhead nyo. Sasabihin ko ilang percent, 2%. Decrease your overhead by 2%. Yan ang budget na isasabit namin should never be equal to last year. So it should be 2% lower. Kasi NOG ang binigay sa amin guidance. So that's one example of top-down budgeting. Okay. Next is bottom-up budgeting. So honestly, what happens here is top management provides the assumptions for budgeting. So for example, ito ang strategy natin. Right? Dahil ito ang strategy natin, so ang i-assume natin, kailangan may expansion abroad, kailangan yung ating base business in the Philippines should be strong and stable. Right? So kumbaga, assumptions in terms of strategy. Ito ang strategy natin. Okay? And then middle managers will provide instructions on how to implement it. Middle managers will provide instructions on how to implement it, and then low-level managers will actually do the planning. Okay? Once they plan, they form suggestions, and then middle managers will consolidate. The completed budget will be approved by top management. Okay? So, anong binigay ng top management? Guidance only. Ito ang strategy natin. Middle level managers provided the details or the instructions. Low level managers participated in the planning process. No? And so they have high commitment because they have ownership in the output. Right? They own the budget. So therefore, there's a higher chance that they will be able to implement it. Okay? And it's probably more realistic because it came from the ground. Kasi kung dictated from the top, hindi naman nagtatrabaho, hindi naman nakikita ng top management yung details of expenses. And so therefore, lower level management are actually in the best position to provide a meaningful budget. Okay? So, however, there are some points. One is it may include buffers or what stand value or mas hindi or a term that's used in the book is budget gaming, which we'll discuss later. Game yung budget. Okay? Siyempre, kung yung mag-implement ng strategy, ang siya ring maker ng budget, siyempre lalagyan niya ng buffer yan. Para kunyari, magkamali ako, meron tayong extra budget. So it could be wasteful. Or there could be some form of inefficiency in the budget because of this conflict between the implementer and the maker. Siyempre, dadagdagan nila yung mga sarili nilang budget. Okay? So the resulting budget here might not be in line with the ambitions or predictions of that management. And it could be wasteful because there could be sandbagging or there could be budget gaming. So yung bottom-up budgeting is also not perfect. The middle ground is what we call the iterative budgeting. So it starts out as bottom-up. So this portion is bottom-up budgeting. But this portion is top-down budgeting. Right? So it starts out at bottom-up and then in the first approval, titignan ng management, ay, hindi ako happy dyan. Increase net profit by 5%. Then, you make the revisions. And then there's a new proposal, and it's iterative. So, kung hindi pa rin masaya management, revise it. So, obviously, the pro is it combines the strength of both methods. The con is it is time-consuming. There's a lot of resources that you need to allocate if it's iterative budgeting. Revisions may undermine commitment, okay, because this portion is top-down na. Right? So may mga commitments dito during the bottom-up budgeting portion, no? Pero pagdating ng top-down, baka na-undermine na yung mga commitment na yun. Or nadagdagan yung commitment, dinadagdagan yung budget. Right? And so, it may undermine the, the ability of uh, lower level management to implement strategy. Okay? So, those are some pros and cons with respect to iterative budgeting. So, it's not a perfect, no, there's no prescription na isa lang ang pwede or isa hindi. But of course, iterative budgeting is good because it combines the pros of the two methods. However, it's very time consuming. So for example, I work for Manila Water. In Manila Water, we start the budgeting process in June and have it approved by the board by November. Imagine that. Okay? So June, nagsa-strategic planning na kami para next year. Tapos ang ultimate approval of the budget is November. November ang board meeting ng Manila Water din. So imagine, June to November, we're doing strategic planning and budget. Aside from implementing, no, aside from implementing the strategy, no, that was implemented last year. Okay, so those are things that we know that are the main weaknesses of the iterative budgeting process. Okay? Now, the second decision that you have to make, okay, is the budgetary control. Okay? How do you use the budget in evaluating performance of people? Are you going to implement a tight budgetary control or a loose budgetary control? Okay? Kung tight ang budgetary control, ibig sabihin, you are um, using the budget as a strict evaluation tool with little acceptance for deviations. So kung off ka by 2%, off ka by 2%. Hindi ka off ka, meaning for example, sales. Dapat 10 million ang sales. Off ka by 2%. So, ilan yun? Say, 98 million. Tama. Yeah, 90, yari, 100 million ang sales. Na-target, 98 million ng actual. Off ka by 2%. So, the 2% is will go down in your evaluation. Right? And those deviations are still underperformance. So, so the budget becomes a Bible for implementation. No? And the outcome, whether you are within or outside the budget, no, is linked towards reward or punishment within the organization. Linked to bonuses, linked to promotion, etc. Okay, so that's a tight budgetary control. In loose budgetary control, on the other hand, you can understand that the budget is an educated guess, and therefore you know that you will not use the budget as in a performance mechanism or a performance appraisal mechanism, but you use the budget as a guide to operations, not necessarily that it's going to be implemented to the T. Okay? So evaluation is more of a constructive discussion regarding how the unit has performed, what can be learned of it, and what improvements can be made in the future. In other words, to what extent is the budget a central component of performance evaluation? If it's a central component, tight budgetary control ang tawag doon. If it is not a main component or not a critical component of budget or of performance evaluation of managers, then it's loose budgetary control. Again, there's no prescription whether it's going to be tight budgetary control or loose budgetary control. It simply means the question is how important is adherence to the budget in the implementation of the strategy of the organization. Okay. One example is this. One strategy, for example, of an organization is expand abroad. Yun ang strategy. Para maka-expand ka abroad, what will you do? You can acquire companies abroad, right? Okay. When you acquire companies abroad, Okay? You need money so that you can perform due diligence dun sa bibilhin mong company abroad, right? You need money so that you can travel abroad and talk to different potential acquirees in a business combination or in a merger deal, right? Now, in that case, pwedeng ang na-budget lang is, say, 20 million pesos. And that budget assumed that you will be acquiring a business somewhere in Southeast Asia. Okay? Pero, as time goes by, no, nakakita ka ng magandang opportunity for expansion in Chile, for example, which is like 12 12 hours time difference from Manila. And obviously, transaction costs will be higher. Obviously, travel costs will be higher. Okay? So in that case, will it be tight budgetary control or loose budgetary control? Even though you have a budget of 20 million, the strategy of the organization is to expand abroad. There's an opportunity in Chile. Are we going to withhold resources? Are we going to stick to a tight budgetary control of 20 million? So if that's the case, mawawala yung Chile opportunity for expansion. So in that case, baka dapat lose ang budgetary control with respect to that strategy, right? So if it lose, then they are able to add more budget, no, to discuss to the new business development team, and then they can now go to Chile and to close that deal, although with a higher transaction cost or higher travel costs. So in that case, obviously, loose budgetary control was essential to the um, to the attainment of the strategy of an organization. Yun naman, tight budgetary control is an essential. Halimbawa, production, right? Obviously, yung cost per unit, dapat yan nag-change ng basta-basta, right? There's a standard costing for that. So, tight ang budgetary control natin with respect to production cost, right? Hindi naman yan nagsiswing basta-basta in terms of costing. Unlike yung kanina, yung ating new business development team trying to find or acquire an expansion company abroad. Kasi it could be in a place that's so far away or so near. Okay? So may kinalalagyan yung tight budgetary control and loose budgetary control. Okay? It depends on the strategy of an organization. Now we talked about this in terms of budget gaming. So the problem with budget is pwedeng laruin ng budgets. Okay? Dito lumalabas yung problem with respect to information asymmetry between the makers of the budget, lower level managers, and approvers of budgets, which is upper management, the top management. There's an information asymmetry there. Low level management know more about operations than top level management. And since they know the details, they can game the budget, right? So there should be mechanisms for top level management to be able to determine whether the budget proposal is being gamed. Okay? What is the budgetary control or what is the control mechanism of top management with respect to budget gaming? Finance people or the controllership people. Sila ang tumitingin, okay, whether the budget proposals provided by departments are being gamed or not. Kaya controllership people or finance people like you and me need to be immersed in operations because tayo yung konsensya of the company. No? These different departments, they are incentivized to game the budget. Okay? And when they game the budget, suboptimal ang lumalabas na budget for the organization. It's incumbent upon finance and controllership, to review those budgets and to make sure that this budget gaming is at the minimum. So when we talk about budget gaming, it can be in terms of two things. Number one, showing a better budget than expected, which is the exposure type of gaming, or showing a worse budget than expected, say hedging. Okay? So yung exposure na budget gaming, uso yan sa sales forecast. Okay? Kasi kailangan makapag-project ka ng higher sales para makakuha ka ng higher budget. Right? So if you're the salespeople, kailangan mag-project ka ng higher sales para makapag-justify ka ng mga sales campaign mo. Right? So you are incentivized to overestimate sales and therefore increase the budget exposure. Okay? Kung ikaw naman accounting, wala kang revenues, you are incentivized, no, to pad your budget. Lakihan mo yung budget mo kasi baka may mga bigla tayong gastusin in the future. Right? And so, hedging naman ang issue doon. Okay? Now, budget gaming depends on budgetary control, whether tight or loose. Kasi kung tight or loose yan, it also motivates managers to design their budget in a certain way. Okay? Obviously, profitability. Okay? Kung mataas ang profitability ng organization, there's a higher propensity to hedge, okay? Or to pad their expense budget. Kasi mataas naman ang kita ng kumpanya. Okay? Kung mababa ang kita ng kumpanya, there's a propensity for exposure. No? Mababa ang profit natin, sige nga, dagdagan pa natin ng sales, kaya naman siguro. So, profitability affects budget gaming.